At North Hills Church, we're doing a sermon series called Bible Stories You Ought to Know. And this morning, I think the Bible story we ought to remind ourselves of and know is this wonderful story of Esther. And I think the best way to think about the story of Esther is to think of it like a grand opera. The curtain opens, chapter 1, with Act 1, when Xerxes has become king of Persia. Xerxes, frankly, is a spoiled brat who was just handed a kingdom from his father. And it almost sounds cliche, but it's true. He stumbled into power and wealth and simply has no idea how to handle any of it. On top of that, he has a tremendous appetite for luxury and parties and has absolutely no self-control. He also likes beautiful women. So Act 1, Xerxes is throwing a lavish party for his friends, a party of 180 days. The drinking, we're told, was out of flagons. Imagine, if you will, a coffee pot full of wine, and you're just pouring the wine from a coffee pot into your mouth. Who can even do that? For 180 days. The partiers are more than tipsy, and they're not making really good choices. Nevertheless, about a week before the party comes to an end, Xerxes and his drunken buddies decide it's time to call for the queen. And they ask the queen to come in and make sure she's wearing her crown. The queen is paying attention to what's going on, and she's no dummy. She knows it's not the crown that Xerxes and his drunken buddies want to get their hands on. She says no. This enrages Xerxes and the drunken friends. They say, there will be no contempt from our own wives when we go back home, when they learn that even the queen can disobey a king. So I can't even say this with a straight face, they get the king to pass a decree that every man will be the master of his own home. And so the king passes a decree that all the men from now on will be masters of their own home, and they're to go home and tell their wives this. And Xerxes gets rid of his queen. Well, Xerxes wakes up the next morning sober, and he may be the master of his own home, but he realizes he's the only one in it. So his drinking buddies now come up with plan B to get a queen. They say, let's have a beauty pageant. And whoever wins, by your decree, O king, will be the new queen. And Xerxes, like I said, is the kind of guy who would love that kind of idea. So he goes for it. He sends eunuchs out to scour the whole country for beauty queen contestants. They're brought to the palace. But get this, before Xerxes will meet them, they have to undergo a spa treatment. How extravagant? It was decreed that before one of these contestants could go before the king, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months of perfumes and cosmetics. So it's at this point that Esther now finally comes onto the stage. She's one of the contestants. She also just happens to be the young niece of a guy named Mordecai. Mordecai is a Jew. He's there because he was taken, his descendants, from Jerusalem. So Esther is Jewish. But she chooses not to bring this up in the interview portion of the pageant. It's her secret. Esther wins the pageant, and she is selected by Xerxes to be his new queen. And so a Jewish girl, a descendant of the exiles, has become queen of Persia. And the curtain closes on Act 1. Astonishing. Act 2. A very ambitious, high-ranking man in the king's court named Haman is promoted in the government. And he thinks with his promotion, wouldn't it be a grand idea, given my new position, that when I walk down the street, everybody should bow to me. And he takes advantage of the king and passes such a law. It's so fun, try it sometime, to walk down a street and watch everybody bow before you. And everyone did, except Mordecai, the queen's uncle. Because he was Jewish, his faith said that he should not bow down to anyone. Haman sees everybody bowing down to him except this one Jewish man standing tall and disobeying his law. So Haman gets the king to pass another silly decree. Because the Jews won't obey this law and they don't honor me or you, ergo, they're a threat to your kingdom and we need to go get away with them. They won't bow or listen to orders. If they don't listen to this one, who knows what other orders they won't follow. We should have a decree that everybody who does not follow this law and is Jewish should be killed. Accordingly, Haman even erects a 75-foot pole outside his house, and he plans to impale his first victim, Mordecai. And that will be an example to everybody who will not bow to him. Mordecai knows this. He knows he's a wanted man and on death's row. So he sends word to Queen Esther in the palace, his niece, and says, you got to stop this. You got to do something. I mean, it's going to be me, and then it's going to be all the Jews. And you're a Jew, Esther. Esther says, I can't do anything about this. It was not even allowed for the queen to go see the king unless he first summoned her. She would risk her life by just charging into the throne room. She says, who am I? And Mordecai says, Esther, don't think that I'm suggesting that you will be spared if you do this. I understand the stakes, but you've got to do this. And then he says one more thing to her. He says, and Esther, who knows? Perhaps you've come to be queen for just such a time as this. That strikes home. And Esther realizes that this is it. She said, if I perish, I perish. I've got to do this. Go talk to the king, revoke this silly decree, and save my people. And I'm running out of time. So Esther hatches a plan. How to get this done. It's a doozy. Remember when I told you that we know the king likes parties? Esther said, he loves parties. I'm going to throw him a party. And she throws such a great party that the king says, what can I do to thank you, my queen, for such a great party? And she says, you throw a second better party. And the king says, perfect. And she said, and this time, why don't you invite Haman? He says, okay, to the better party. So Haman shows up to the better party. It's a bash. They're all tipsy again. And at that second party, Esther then tells Xerxes about the decree to kill the Jews. And then she reveals to her husband that she is a Jew. And with tears, she pleads with him to revoke this order to kill her people. Xerxes is not only sympathetic, but he turns furious that such an order even existed. In his rage, he asks, who caused such an order to be given? Who was it that manipulated me? And Esther points at Haman, the guy that was going to kill the Jews. And the king storms out of the courtroom. And while the king is gone, Haman could read the cards. He's terrified. He goes over to Esther. He falls down at her feet. He starts clutching at her skirts in desperation to plead for mercy at the very same time that the king comes back and sees Haman grabbing his wife's skirt, and he thinks he is accosting her. And he says, execute him. And so Haman is executed on the very same pole that he had erected for Mordecai. He is killed on the same pole that was erected to kill the Jews. And the curtain closes. I'm going to leave that cliffhanger, and you can go home and read Acts 3 and 4. But we have to stop here. And because it's Reformation Day, I would be remiss to tell you at this point that John Calvin himself never preached on this book. And Martin Luther, who was never one to hold back, said about the book of Esther, "I am so great an enemy of the book of Esther that I wish it had not come to us at all, for it has far too many heathen unnaturalities." Why would Calvin and Luther not embrace the book of Esther? First of all, because the story I just presented you, as presented in the Bible, is presented without any criticism. When I told you about Xerxes, I editorialized all that stuff. I made it clear that Xerxes' court was not a godly place, but the text doesn't say that. It offers no moral commentary on Xerxes or his behavior. The narrator gives no hint that the partying and the vanity and the Holocaust plans are a problem. It's just reported. If you are the sort of person that's attracted to 180 days of drinking wine out of a coffee pot, there's nothing in this text to discourage you. That could be why Calvin and Luther avoided preaching on Esther. But there's a second reason also they would not embrace Esther. And maybe it's even the thing why not. In all of this narrative, in the entire book, there is never once a mention of the name of God, or God's law, or God's decree, or God's character. Absolutely nothing. Nada. So the reformers avoided this book because it never mentions God. It might be a great opera and a fantastic story, but where is God? They would ask. And if God is not mentioned, how are we going to proclaim the good news? Better to move on to some other texts. And I would respond, however, to say that the answer is Esther is in the Bible, remembering that just because God's name isn't mentioned doesn't mean that God isn't in it. All that it just happened stuff that ensured God's chosen people, the Jews, would be spared, who was behind that, do you think? Who do you think was behind the choice to make Esther queen and that her uncle just happened to be Mordecai? On the surface, it seems like everything in this story is just the operatic, ordinary machinations of power and love and politics, lust and greed. On the surface, it just looks like human plotting and planning, but in the end, we can say with the saved, we were so worried, we couldn't sense God's presence. We had no idea how to get out of this situation. It all felt so random and senseless. It felt like we were sure to be destroyed. But we look back and we see that God was with us the whole time. God was in complete control. Just because God's name isn't mentioned doesn't mean that God isn't present. And then there's that ending. Remember of Haman ending up on the execution pole meant for somebody else? Might that kind of allude to another story we know kind of well? What other time did God move to take an instrument of chaos that was meant to destroy his work and then work a great reversal, a great victory through that thing, and instead of death, gave life? Such a great victory that this thing which was supposed to destroy God's purpose instead destroyed God's enemies. A thing that was meant to be a symbol of death is now lifted up to become a symbol of salvation and somehow causes us in response to plan a feast. Of course, the cross of Jesus. Jesus' cross, too, was a symbol of chaos and torture set up by the enemy to end this thing. The powers of evil said, we can use this cross to finally destroy this Jew and get rid of these people. and they lifted Jesus high, and his naked body hung on that pole. And the evil one said, "Victory is near. We passed a decree." And instead, Jesus dealt a mortal blow to that evil one, so that now even the ancient powers are in retreat and confusion. And now we plan a feast. We gather around the table to say God's promises are unshakable. So I think part of the fact that Esther never mentions the name of God is not a fault, but a power. Because just because God's name isn't mentioned doesn't mean that God isn't part of the story. And I think in that sense, Esther is a lot like all of our days, isn't it? On a lot of regular days for me, and especially on what I call my exile days, when I'm not feeling so great or up, there's really no obvious movement of God. There's no glorious miracle. There's no voices from heaven. In most of our ordinary days, there's no burning bushes. There's no people walking on water. No angel visitants. No miraculous multiplications of crusty bread and smelly fish. I'm sure many of you, just like Esther, go through the whole day where nobody will ever say to you anything about God, or anybody seems to be thinking anything about God at all. I'm sure tomorrow at Monday morning staff meeting, many of you won't open it with prayer, or in your staff meeting hear the name of God mentioned. And so it can seem like Esther that we live in this world ruled by random chance and the plotting of the powerful. But don't be fooled. Esther is here to remind us that our world belongs to God, and he's working all things for your salvation, whether his name is or isn't mentioned. So this week, friends, when you're about to walk into a situation where you think evil is winning, where it feels as though you are losing ground, when you feel as though there is no way out of this mess, when it feels like it's too much for you, when you can't find or even hear God's name in a situation, you remember the God of Esther is with you. The God who raised Jesus is with you. And who knows, maybe you're precisely in that situation for just such a time as this. Amen.